Before we begin, a quick friendly reminder. If you enjoy wild real-life stories of property drama, HOA chaos, and entitled neighbors getting the shock of their lives, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps our channel grow and ensures you never miss the next unbelievable tale. Now, let's dive into the story. The trouble began quietly, almost like a change in the wind. For generations, the farm had stood peacefully at the edge of the county. A patchwork of hayfields, old barns, and rolling pastures that carried the weight of family history. The land had belonged to the narrator's grandfather, who worked it with nothing more than stubborn hands and calloused grit. It passed to the narrator's father, who expanded the barns, dug a deeper pond for cattle, and taught his children that soil was more than dirt. It was heritage. And now it was his turn, the third caretaker of a legacy built on honest work and respect for boundaries. For decades, life remained predictable. Mornings began with the sound of roosters and the smell of damp hay. Evenings ended with the lowing of cattle returning to the barn. It was a quiet life, not glamorous, but steady. Out here, neighbors nodded respectfully from their trucks, waved across fence lines, and kept to their own. The unspoken code was simple. You tend your land, I'll tend mine. Boundaries were sacred, but quiet never lasts forever. Just beyond the property line, the fields that once stretched empty for miles began to change. Developers arrived, the kind with glossy brochures and survey flags that pierced the earth like needles. Heavy equipment chewed the soil into squares and cul-de-sacs. Overnight, the cornfields turned to concrete. The developers called it a planned lifestyle community, complete with fountains, guard shacks, and a manicured vision of country living that had nothing to do with real country life. With the community came the inevitable, the HOA. At first, it seemed harmless. A small group of suburban transplants who wanted their lawns perfect and their mailboxes painted the same shade of beige. Their rules had no reach beyond their gates, and so long as they stayed on their side, it was no concern. Or so the narrator thought. Then came the woman who would change everything. Her name was Karen, and though it was technically Karen Thompson, she carried herself like a queen stripped out of some suburban fairy tale. She introduced herself loudly at local events, calling herself the lifestyle chairwoman of Meadowbrook Estates, as though the title gave her dominion over the county. She wore yoga outfits worth more than farm machinery and strutted about as though every gravel road should bend for her tires. Her first interactions seemed laughable. She wrinkled her nose at the sight of mud-splattered boots. She complained at the farmer's market that fresh eggs could be displayed more elegantly, as though chickens were boutique designers. She dismissed the farm's rustic fences as out of sync with community aesthetics. First, it was easy to ignore. Every town had people like her, loud, entitled, harmless. But Karen was not satisfied with simply ruling her subdivision. She saw the neighboring farmland as a blemish on her picture-perfect kingdom, and in her mind, it needed elevating. It began with flyers, glossy invitations tucked into the farmhouse mailbox, urging participation in beautification initiatives. They asked for cooperation in aligning with Meadowbrook standards. The narrator chuckled, tossed them in the trash, and thought nothing more of it. But Karen was persistent. Soon, notices appeared taped to the barn, printed lists of so-called violations, unpainted structures visible from roadway, improper storage of equipment, lack of uniform fencing. The absurdity was clear. This was private farmland, not part of their HOA. Yet Karen acted as if it fell under her rule. And where most would have stopped at a flyer, she escalated. HOA volunteers with clipboards began walking the fence lines, scribbling notes, snapping photos of cattle as if documenting evidence for some suburban trial. A tractor parked in the field became unsightly vehicle storage. The smell of manure became nuisance odors. To the narrator, it was laughable. To Karen, it was war. And then came the SUV. Shiny, black, and polished like a trophy. It rolled onto the farm road one morning and parked there as though it belonged. At first, the narrator thought it must have broken down. But no, the engine was fine, the lights off, the vehicle deliberately placed right in the middle of the hay road. Blocking access, daring response. And behind the tinted glass, Karen herself sat scrolling her phone, as though she had discovered a new parking space created just for her. The nerve was astounding. The road was not public. It was not shared. It was the daily route for tractors hauling hay, the narrow access carved through years of hard work. Yet Karen treated it as overflow parking, an extension of Meadowbrook's curb appeal. She told her HOA followers that the space expanded the community footprint, that it was underutilized rural land, and therefore fair game. For days, the SUV remained. Neighbors from the subdivision walked by, admiring it as though it were a monument. Some even took photos, proud of their supposed expansion. And while the narrator clenched fists and swallowed rising anger, Karen grew bolder. She hosted a brunch on the pasture, setting tables by the pond as if the farm were her private venue. Yoga mats unfurled across the hayfield. Suburban guests sipped mimosas while ducks pecked at their shoes. To Karen, it was charm. To the narrator, it was trespass dressed as entitlement. It was at that moment the realization hit. This was no longer a matter of annoyance. This was an invasion. Piece by piece, boundary by boundary, the HOA queen was testing limits. And if left unchecked, the land itself, his family's land, would be swallowed by their arrogance. The narrator sat that evening on the porch, beer in hand, staring at the glint of the SUV in the moonlight. The arrogance of it burned into his vision. He had been patient, more patient than most. But patience has its limits. There came a time when a farmer put his boot down. And in that moment, he decided, if Karen wanted to make the land her playground, then she would learn what farm-style consequences looked like. The first chapter of battle had been written. The SUV was only the beginning. The days that followed marked the shift from irritation into outright confrontation, though no words were spoken in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a battle of actions, each one layered with entitlement on one side and stubborn resolve on the other. The SUV remained in place, shining arrogantly in the morning sun, blocking machinery and muddying the narrow farm road. Its presence was no accident, no misunderstanding. It was a declaration. Karen had staked her claim not with survey maps or legal documents, but with steel and rubber. To her, the vehicle was a flag, planted in conquered ground. To the farmer, it was the embodiment of everything wrong with this new development. A lack of respect, a disregard for boundaries, and a dangerous belief that appearances outweighed reality. But if the SUV was a flag, the brunch was a full-scale invasion. It began innocently enough. A few cars from the subdivision rolling up to the pond, their drivers carrying folding tables and coolers. By mid-morning, the field had transformed into a suburban daydream. Pastel tablecloths, sparkling glasses filled with champagne, and the smell of quiche drifting over the hay. Yoga mats stretched in neat rows across ground meant for livestock. Ducks waddled between chairs, confused and irritated, while cattle lined the fence as if observing a strange ritual. Karen was, of course, at the center. Wide-brimmed sun hat perched proudly on her head, glass of wine in hand, though it was barely 10 o'clock. She welcomed her guests as if the farm were a rented venue. Cameras clicked, capturing every angle of the rustic luxury event. And for those brief hours, the farm ceased to be a farm at all. It was reduced to an accessory, a backdrop for her curated lifestyle. For the farmer, watching from the edge of his porch, it was more than trespassing. It was mockery. Every inch of soil his family had bled and sweated to preserve was now trampled under the weight of folding chairs and HOA vanity. And as he watched, something hardened inside him. Patience was no longer an option. When the sun dipped low and the last car rolled away, silence returned to the farm. But the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, charged, waiting for the next move. And that night, as the moon reflected over the pond, the farmer walked the perimeter slowly, boots pressing into soil that carried both memory and weight. He paused by the water, staring at the faint tire tracks left behind. That was when the idea took root. Nature, after all, had always been the greatest enforcer. Fences could be climbed, locks could be broken, papers could be argued in court. But the land itself, it remembered. Soft earth swallowed what did not belong. Mud consumed arrogance without care for titles or bylaws. And here, at the edge of the pond, He realized he held the greatest ally in this war: the ground beneath their feet. The plan began with preparation. In the shed sat the old excavator, its steel frame weathered, its hydraulics groaning but loyal. It had dug trenches, moved earth, and carried burdens far heavier than arrogance. Now it would serve one more purpose. He spent the evening testing its strength, its reach, the way its bucket could carve the soil in deliberate strokes. Slowly, carefully, he loosened the bank near the water, disguising it beneath a smooth layer of earth. To an untrained eye, it looked solid. To anyone who dared park atop it, it would become quicksand. It was not malice that drove him, but justice. He had endured flyers, trespassing, insults shouted from SUV windows. He had watched his farm reduced to a backdrop for suburban vanity. Enough was enough. If Karen insisted on claiming the land as hers, then the land itself would rise to remind her of its true master. Morning came, and with it Karen returned. She drove the SUV proudly across the field, leading a small parade of HOA followers behind her. Cameras ready, clipboards in hand, they gathered at the pond as though unveiling a new attraction. She parked precisely where the ground had been softened, her tires pressing into soil that looked firm but was already betraying her weight. She stepped out, sunglasses glinting, arms wide as if presenting her empire. The farmer watched silently from a distance, leaning against his tractor, coffee in hand. He didn't need to say a word. The stage was set. The ground shifted slightly beneath the SUV, a whisper of what was to come. None of them noticed. They were too busy pointing at the water, envisioning gazebos and wedding venues, talking of expansion and community synergy. They didn't realize that expansion has limits, and arrogance always carries a cost. The excavator's engine roared to life, and heads turned. Karen scoffed, unimpressed, assuming it was nothing more than a show of intimidation. But this wasn't intimidation. It was inevitability. The bucket lowered slowly, deliberately, shifting the earth just enough to tip the balance. And then nature did the rest. The SUV tilted forward, wheels spinning helplessly against softening soil. Its polished frame dipped, nose first, toward the pond. Panic erupted among the HOA entourage. Clipboards dropped, phones recorded frantically, voices shrieked demands that someone stop it. But the ground was no longer theirs to control. It had claimed the arrogance they brought upon it. Karen screamed, running to the vehicle, clawing at the doors, but gravity is impartial. The SUV slid further, mud swallowing its wheels, water lapping at its bumper. The farmer remained calm, sipping from his thermos, as if watching the harvest come in. Justice was not loud. Justice was patient. And here, justice looked like steel and leather being swallowed whole by the earth. By the time the sun reached its peak, the SUV was half submerged, its gleaming finish dulled by mud and water. Karen stood on the bank, drenched in humiliation, mascara streaking, barking promises of lawsuits that would never hold. Her empire of entitlement had cracked, and everyone watching knew it. But this was only the beginning. The sinking of the SUV was not the end of the conflict. It was the spark that would ignite a far greater fire. Karen would not retreat quietly. Entitlement rarely drowns easily. And though the pond had swallowed her pride, she would soon return with fury, armed not with vehicles, but with paperwork, threats, and the machinery of bureaucracy. The farmer knew this, and as he watched the SUV's roof glint faintly above the waterline, he prepared himself for what was to come. The battle was no longer just about a vehicle. It was about the right to defend land against arrogance disguised as authority. And the next chapter would bring the war directly to his doorstep. The SUV's slow descent into the pond should have been the end of it. For any reasonable person, the sight of a vehicle swallowed whole by the earth would have been warning enough. But entitlement rarely surrenders quietly. Where most would feel shame, Karen felt outrage. Her pride was heavier than steel, and the sinking of her prized possession did not humble her. It ignited her fury. Within days, Meadowbrook Estates transformed into a hive of restless energy. HOA board members gathered in emergency meetings, clipboards bristling with notes, Maps spread across polished dining tables. They whispered about boundaries, community rights, and necessary action. The story of the sinking had already spread through the county, carried by teenagers on dirt bikes, local farmers, and even a few amused deputies who had witnessed the chaos firsthand. Videos circulated online, viewed thousands of times, each replay showing the SUV sliding into the pond while Karen flailed on the bank. What was humiliation for her had become entertainment for everyone else. But Karen could not laugh it off. She could not ignore the stain on her image. She vowed to turn embarrassment into revenge, and she wielded the only weapons she understood: bureaucracy, intimidation, and the relentless machinery of the HOA. It began with papers, brightly colored notices taped to fence posts, barn doors, and even a feed trough, each one stamped with the Meadowbrook seal. Violation: unkempt appearance. Violation: unsafe structures. Violation: unauthorized vehicle storage. To anyone who knew the truth, they were meaningless scraps of paper, powerless beyond the subdivision gates. But to Karen, they were declarations of authority. She called them enforcement. The farmer tore them down as quickly as they appeared. But the more he removed, the more appeared, until bright orange and neon green sheets fluttered across his property like invasive weeds. It was laughable, but it was also relentless. Day after day, the HOA patrol arrived, suburban soldiers armed with clipboards, cameras, and Karen's approval. Then came the megaphone. On a bright morning, the quiet of the farm was shattered by a convoy of SUVs, and even a golf cart with the word security stenciled in bold across its side. Out stepped Karen, dressed in an orange blazer that clashed with the countryside, oversized sunglasses shielding her eyes, and a brand new megaphone in hand. Her entourage flanked her like loyal knights, clipboards at the ready. They stood at the edge of the Hay Road, declaring encroachment and unsafe conditions. They accused the farm of lowering community standards, of endangering their children with unregulated livestock and unsightly structures. They even circled maps printed from the internet with red markers, claiming the land as shared environment. To the farmer, it was almost comical. They waved papers like swords, thrusting them toward the barns and fields as though pieces of neon cardstock carried legal weight. But beneath the absurdity lay danger. Entitlement mixed with persistence has power, even if it is built on lies. And Karen's determination was unshaken. She believed that if she declared ownership loudly enough, the world would bend to her vision. The sheriff's deputies were eventually called, not by the farmer, but by Karen herself. She demanded intervention, demanded that he be arrested for vehicular sabotage and property obstruction. But when the deputies arrived, they found no crime. They found a deed that had been in the farmer's family for generations, laminated and waiting in the glove box for moments exactly like this. They found trespassers on private land, and they found a sinking SUV that had no business being there. Karen raged, mascara smudging, voice cracking through her megaphone. She argued that rural access land was a shared right, that community spirit demanded cooperation. The deputies chuckled. Rural access was not a law. Spirit was not an argument. In the end, the only truth that mattered was ink on a deed and boots on the ground. But Karen did not stop. She could not. To retreat would mean defeat, and to accept defeat would mean admitting the farm had boundaries stronger than her will. And so, she escalated again. Insurance claims were filed, but denied. Lawsuits were threatened, but with no basis. Yet she pressed forward, convinced that persistence alone could break the resolve of the farmer. The HOA began circulating petitions, whispering to new residents about expansion and community integration. They painted the farmer not as a neighbor but as a menace, an obstacle to progress. At night, the farmer sat on his porch, watching the glow of subdivision lights beyond the tree line. Where once had been darkness, there was now a steady orange haze, artificial and unyielding. He listened to the hum of distant traffic, the muffled sounds of HOA gatherings, and he understood the truth. Karen was not finished. The sinking of the SUV was only one battle in a war that would not end quickly. But he was not afraid. Farmers do not bend easily. They face storms, droughts, and predators. They endure when others quit. And as he ran his hand across the steel frame of his excavator, he knew he had something the HOA would never understand: patience, persistence, and the weight of the land itself. The fight was far from over. Karen would be back, not with a single SUV, but with an army of papers, threats, and followers eager to claim what was never theirs. And when she came, she would discover that boundaries are not erased with clipboards and megaphones. The war was only beginning, and the land was ready to remember. By the time the fourth week rolled around, the farm no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fortress under siege. The battles were not fought with weapons or fists, but with paper, intimidation, and endless persistence. Karen had transformed Meadowbrook Estates into her personal army, and every day their presence pressed heavier against the land. The SUV, half submerged in the pond, had become both a spectacle and a scar. Locals passed by to gawk, snapping photos, laughing at the viral video that now circled the internet. Farmers leaned on fence posts, shaking their heads in disbelief at the sheer arrogance of it all. Teenagers rode dirt bikes up to the pond, pointing and jeering at the absurdity of a luxury vehicle swallowed by mud. To the county, it was entertainment. To Karen, it was humiliation she could not wash away. And humiliation breeds retaliation. It began with patrols. Every morning, a small team of HOA volunteers would march the property line, clipboards in hand, snapping photos of barns, machinery, and even livestock. They scribbled furiously, cataloging infractions, as though preparing for a trial that would never come. The cows were labeled nuisances. The tractors were labeled unsightly. The smell of hay was deemed offensive to community standards. Each observation was followed by a neon-colored violation notice, taped boldly to fence posts, nailed to the barn, and even stuck to a chicken coop. Soon, the notices multiplied like weeds. Dozens littered the property, fluttering in the wind, turning the farm into a patchwork of accusations. Each one was meaningless in the eyes of the law, but their sheer number carried weight. It was not about legal power, it was about psychological pressure. Karen wanted to wear down patience, to exhaust resolve, to make the farmer bend through sheer persistence. When the notices failed to break him, she escalated again. Flyers circulated through town, painting the farm as a danger to property values, as a blight on the new development. Words like unsafe, hazardous, and unregulated appeared in bold letters, designed to spark fear. Meetings were held in Meadowbrook's clubhouse, where Karen stood at the front, her sun hat replaced by stern authority, rallying her neighbors to the cause. To her, this was not just about a farm. This was about control, about bending the land into her vision. And then came the blockade. One morning, the farmer stepped outside to find his driveway lined with HOA vehicles. SUVs parked bumper to bumper, blocking access. They stood like a wall of steel, polished and deliberate, cutting off the only entry to his property. The convoy included not just Karen's loyalists, but hired security in a golf cart, their presence laughable yet suffocating. They waved papers in the air, claiming authority, declaring that community standards demanded enforcement. The farmer did not rage. He did not shout. He sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, watching them like cattle wandering into the wrong pasture. Patience was his greatest weapon, and patience told him that arrogance always overplays its hand. As the blockade continued, the HOA staged their boldest maneuver yet. They erected signs, shiny, freshly printed, bearing the Meadowbrook logo. No parking, private property, community expansion zone. They planted them along the fence line, at the edge of the hay road, and even near the pond where the SUV still rested. It was as though they were redrawing the map with plastic stakes and laminated symbols, as though words printed on aluminum could erase generations of ownership. But the farmer understood something they did not. Signs could be pulled, papers could be burned. Boundaries etched into deeds and preserved by time could not be erased by suburban vanity. Still, he knew the danger was real. This was not just noise anymore. Karen had begun filing petitions with the county, attempting to argue for rezoning, for annexation, for any legal foothold that could turn trespass into ownership. Bureaucracy is slow, but persistence makes it dangerous. If ignored, it could grow teeth. So the farmer prepared. He gathered old documents, deeds passed down from his father, surveys marked with stamps, conservation easements that classified parts of the land as federally protected. He laminated copies, filed extras, and placed them where they could not be touched. He spoke with neighboring farmers, men and women who had faced similar intrusions from developers and who knew that arrogance disguised as progress must always be resisted. Quietly, he built his defense. Meanwhile, the land itself whispered patience. The pond remained still, its surface reflecting the outline of the drowned SUV like a monument. The cattle chewed calmly in their fields, unbothered by the noise beyond the fence. The soil lay steady, waiting, as if it too understood that time was on its side. But patience does not mean inaction. The farmer knew that one more push from Karen would not be met with silence. The siege had gone on long enough. The farm was not a playground, not a canvas for her fantasies. It was heritage, sweat, blood, and dignity carved into acres of earth. One evening, as the sun set over the fields and the subdivision lights flickered to life in the distance, the farmer stood by the pond. The roof of the SUV glistened faintly above the water, a reminder of arrogance swallowed whole. He ran his hand along the steel frame of his excavator, parked and waiting like a slumbering beast. Karen believed she had the power of papers and people. But she had forgotten something simple. The land remembers, and the land has its own way of teaching lessons. The farmer decided that the next chapter of this battle would not be written on neon paper or shouted through a megaphone. It would be written in mud, in iron, and in patience sharpened into action. The siege had dragged on long enough. For weeks, the farm had endured waves of petty assaults. Brightly colored notices flapping on fence posts, SUVs blocking the road, Karen's voice amplified through a megaphone as though volume alone could turn arrogance into law. To the outside world, it was comedy. To the farmer, it was insult layered on trespass. And each day that passed wore his patience thinner. But patience is not weakness. It is the quiet sharpening of resolve, the gathering of strength for a moment that matters. And the farmer knew his moment had arrived. The farm had always been more than soil and fences. It carried with it the paperwork of generations. Deeds carefully preserved, surveys stamped by county officials, conservation easements that legally protected its ponds and pastures. While Karen and her board scribbled sharpest circles on internet printouts, the farmer held notarized documents bound by law. And where her power came from clipboards and staged meetings, his came from the permanence of heritage. The first step of his counterstrike was not dramatic. It was meticulous. He visited the county offices, presenting the paperwork his father and grandfather had prepared decades earlier. He refreshed his boundaries in the official registry, ensuring there was no ambiguity, no overlooked line Karen could exploit. He filed copies with the sheriff's department, making it clear that any further trespass would not be neighborly dispute but enforceable violation. Quietly, he fortified his position with the tools of bureaucracy she thought she owned. But paper defenses were only one layer. The land itself was another. The SUV sinking into the pond had taught Karen nothing. To her, it was sabotage. To him, it was justice. And he realized that the soil could still teach lessons in ways courts never could. He walked the property, inspecting low spots where runoff softened the earth, where tire tracks left deep impressions, where arrogance might find itself swallowed whole. Each depression, each muddy bank was a potential ally. The excavator sat waiting in its shed, a sleeping beast eager for purpose. All it needed was the right push and the land would take care of the rest. The counterstrike began quietly. He did not shout. He did not announce his intentions with papers or meetings. Instead, he worked under cover of dawn and dusk, the bucket of the excavator shifting earth just enough to disguise traps in plain sight. To the eye, the pastures looked unchanged, the pond edges firm, the hay road solid. But the farmer knew the truth. The ground had been prepared. What had once swallowed one SUV could easily claim another, or several if arrogance pressed further. Meanwhile, Karen prepared her own escalation. She had not forgiven the pond. The viral video of her shrieking, covered in mud while her vehicle slid into the water, had spread beyond the county. Strangers laughed online. Memes painted her face onto sinking ships, and even within Meadowbrook Estates whispers of doubt began to spread. Her response was predictable. She doubled down. HOA meetings grew louder, more theatrical. She rallied her followers with speeches about protecting community standards and eliminating rural blight. She presented herself as a warrior defending property values, a savior standing between civilization and chaos. The farm was her chosen enemy, and she was determined to crush it. When words failed, she turned to spectacle. Another convoy arrived, larger than before, with even more SUVs and a rented tent for what she called a community assessment summit. They parked along the Hay Road, pitched their tables near the pond, and paraded clipboards as though they were court orders. Cameras clicked, documenting every angle, staging evidence for imagined lawsuits. And there, among them, Karen strutted like royalty, her bright jacket clashing with the natural hues of the countryside. She gestured toward the barns, the tractors, the cattle, declaring them eyesores in need of removal. She spoke of future parks, of gazebos, of wedding venues that would one day replace mud and manure. To her audience, she painted the farm as wasted potential. To the farmer, she painted herself as the living embodiment of disrespect. The farmer did not interfere. Not yet. He sat on his porch, coffee in hand, eyes steady, waiting. Every shovel of dirt he had moved, every trap he had prepared, lingered beneath their feet. And though they did not yet know it, the land was no longer theirs to tread so freely. The climax came when Karen ordered her followers closer to the pond, declaring it an ideal site for a future community water feature. She instructed them to measure, to photograph, to envision benches and flower beds where cattle once drank. Her words echoed across the pasture, brimming with confidence. But the earth has a way of humbling confidence. The bank shifted beneath the weight of polished shoes and high heels. Softened soil sagged, pulling at their footing. A clipboard slipped from nervous hands, tumbling into the muck below. Laughter broke out among the gathered crowd. Not from the HOA, but from local farmers and neighbors who had gathered at a distance to watch the absurd parade. They knew what was coming. The land did not disappoint. With a groan and a slurp, the soil gave way, pulling one unfortunate SUV several feet forward, its wheels sinking into mud prepared days earlier. Panic erupted. Shouts filled the air. Phones recorded as suburban warriors scrambled to save their shining vehicle, its tires spinning helplessly, flinging mud across pressed suits and designer yoga pants. The farmer remained still, unmoved, sipping from his thermos. This was not sabotage. This was inevitability. He had not forced their vehicles into the mud. They had done so themselves by trespassing where they did not belong, by ignoring every warning, by underestimating the patience of a man who understood the land better than they ever would. By the time the vehicle was half buried, the scene was chaos. Karen screamed into her megaphone, demanding rescue, demanding accountability, demanding that the farmer be arrested. But no deputies arrived. No laws had been broken, not by him. The crowd laughed, the cameras rolled, and once again, Karen stood humiliated, covered in mud and fury. The counterstrike had landed. The farm had not raised its voice. It had simply stood its ground, and the ground itself had delivered judgment. But as the convoy slunk away, leaving one vehicle behind to be claimed by mud, the farmer knew this would not be the end. Karen's pride was too heavy to drown so easily. And while she had lost another battle, her war was far from over. She would return, armed with new tactics, more desperate, more dangerous than before. The farmer leaned against his porch railing, eyes fixed on the sinking SUV beside the pond. His patience remained, but it had hardened into resolve. The farm was no longer simply enduring harassment. It was fighting back, slowly, deliberately, with the quiet strength of soil and steel. The siege had turned. The counterstrike had begun. Karen's humiliation should have been enough to quiet her crusade. 2 luxury SUVs swallowed by mud and pond water. 2 viral spectacles that left her red-faced and dripping while the county laughed. It would have made most people retreat into silence. But Karen was not most people. For her, embarrassment was fuel. Each failure hardened her resolve, feeding her obsession with control. And so, she escalated once more. This time, the campaign reached beyond the gates of Meadowbrook Estates. Karen began writing letters, pages of grievances mailed to county commissioners, zoning boards, and even the local news station. She painted the farm as a menace, a danger to community safety and property values. She described livestock as health hazards, tractors as environmental risks, and the pond as an unregulated death trap. Each letter was laced with the same entitlement that had driven her from the beginning, but now it carried the stamp of formality, the weight of bureaucracy. Within weeks, county officials arrived. 2 white trucks rolled up the gravel road, their doors stenciled with government logos. Inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, surveying the land with detached curiosity. They walked the fence lines, peered into barns, and scribbled notes as Karen followed close behind, her voice carrying with smug satisfaction. This was her chance to prove her claims, to turn the farm into a case study for why suburban rules should extend beyond suburban walls. The farmer did not panic. He had expected this. The counterstrike of the previous week had forced Karen's hand, and when arrogance loses on the ground, it retreats into paper battles. But paper was a battlefield he knew well. From the glove box of his truck, he produced the laminated deed, stamped and sealed, showing 3 generations of ownership. From his filing cabinet, he retrieved conservation easement papers, documents filed decades earlier by his father, protecting the pond and surrounding wetlands under federal law. From a weathered folder, he displayed surveys marked with official seals, every boundary line drawn clear and indisputable. The inspectors studied each page carefully. Karen tried to interrupt, waving her hands, insisting the land was under community review, but the officials ignored her. Their duty was not to her vanity, but to the law, and the law was unshakable. The farm's boundaries were ironclad, its status as agricultural land unquestionable, its protection stronger than any HOA bylaw could ever dream to be. When the officials left, their verdict was clear. No violations, no hazards, no authority for Meadowbrook Estates beyond its own gates. Karen's triumphant smile collapsed into rage as the trucks rumbled away, leaving her shouting at empty air. But the reckoning was not over. Denied by the county, she turned to the court of public opinion. She contacted reporters, spinning stories of a rogue farmer endangering a community. She hosted HOA meetings where she presented dramatized evidence. Photos of muddy boots framed as contamination, pictures of cows framed as threats, drone footage of barns labeled as derelict structures. Each presentation grew more desperate, more exaggerated, as if volume could replace truth. And yet, the louder she shouted, the more the community laughed. The viral videos had done their work. The image of Karen shrieking while her SUV slid into the pond could not be erased by flyers or speeches. Every time she tried to present herself as a victim, someone pulled up the footage, replaying the spectacle that contradicted her every word. The reckoning, it turned out, was not just legal. It was reputational. Meadowbrook Estates began to fracture. Some residents, embarrassed by the constant chaos, distanced themselves from Karen. They muttered apologies to the farmer at the feed store, explaining that not everyone in the subdivision shared her obsession. Others quietly stopped attending her meetings, unwilling to tie themselves to her crusade. Even her most loyal supporters began to question whether endless lawsuits and sinking SUVs were worth their time. Karen, of course, noticed the cracks, and cracks bred desperation. She doubled down on her threats, promising lawsuits that never came, citing laws that did not exist, inventing terms like rural access rights and community expansion clauses. Each word revealed her unraveling grip on reality, each outburst making her look less like a leader and more like a caricature. For the farmer, the reckoning was both victory and warning. He had defended his land with patience, with paperwork, and with the quiet strength of soil and steel. But he knew entitlement never dies easily. Karen would keep coming, in one form or another, until she was forced to face the ultimate truth. The land was not hers to claim, and no amount of arrogance could change that. One evening, as the sun set over the pond, the farmer stood by the water's edge. The first SUV still rested beneath the surface, its bumper glinting faintly like a tombstone to arrogance. The second vehicle sagged in the mud nearby, half swallowed, abandoned by its owner. The pond reflected the sky in ripples, serene and indifferent, as if mocking the chaos that had played out on its banks. The farmer understood what the land was saying. Reckonings are not delivered in courts or meetings. They are delivered by time, by patience, and by the earth itself. And while Karen raged and schemed, the farm remained steady, a fortress older than her subdivision, stronger than her rules, and more enduring than her pride. But the story was not yet finished. Karen still had one card left to play, one final desperate attempt to reclaim her dignity. And when she played it, the farm would answer once more, not with words, but with consequences she could never ignore. By now, Karen's crusade had become less about land and more about pride. The failed SUV, the failed petitions, the failed inspections. Each loss chipped away at her authority until only desperation remained. She could not stand the laughter, the whispers in her own community, the way her name had become shorthand for arrogance across the county. And so, in her final attempt to reclaim power, she turned reckless. It began with a meeting, but not like the ones before. Gone were the polite invitations, the pastel flyers, the staged speeches in Meadowbrook's clubhouse. This gathering was held outdoors, in full view of the farm. Folding tables were set up along the hay road. Loudspeakers blasted pop music across the fields. Signs with bold lettering, community land, future park site, say no to blight, lined the fences like a picket line. It was not a meeting. It was a declaration of takeover. Karen arrived in a rented convertible, her sun hat wide, her smile forced. She climbed onto a small platform, megaphone in hand, and announced to her followers that Meadowbrook was moving forward, with or without cooperation. The farm, she declared, was already obsolete. She claimed the HOA had voted to repurpose it into public space, to bulldoze the barns and replace them with manicured trails and picnic lawns. Her voice carried with the authority of someone who believed her imagination could overwrite reality. Then came the construction equipment. 2 rented bulldozers rolled up behind her convoy, their yellow frames gleaming in the sun. It was theater as much as it was threat. Karen had no permits, no approval, no legal standing, but she had staged the illusion of power. Her followers cheered as the engines rumbled, mistaking noise for progress. She raised her hand like a queen granting permission, ready to unleash her machines on soil that had never belonged to her. But arrogance always forgets the land. The farmer had seen this moment coming. For weeks, he had prepared not just with paperwork, but with the earth itself. The soft ground near the pond, the trenches he had carved with quiet precision, the hidden weak spots masked beneath innocent grass, all were waiting. He had not built traps out of malice, but out of foresight. If Karen insisted on testing the land, then the land would answer in its own language. The first bulldozer lurched forward, its treads grinding against the hay road. It rolled confidently toward the pond, its operator oblivious to the softened ground beneath. The machine weighed far more than an SUV, and when it reached the bank, the soil trembled. With a groan that echoed across the field, the earth gave way. The bulldozer pitched forward, its heavy frame sinking nose first into the muck. Water splashed, mud churned, and the once proud machine became a flailing beast trapped in quicksand. Panic erupted. Karen shrieked into her megaphone, demanding rescue. Her followers scattered, some laughing nervously, others shouting orders no one followed. The second bulldozer tried to reverse, but the driver misjudged, its treads catching in the same softened soil. Within minutes, both machines were stuck, their engines roaring helplessly as mud swallowed them deeper. The spectacle was undeniable. Cameras rolled, capturing the chaos from every angle. The image of two bulldozers trapped beside the pond, their operators waving frantically while Karen screamed in fury, spread faster than any flyer or petition ever had. By sunset, the videos would flood social media, turning her final show of strength into the ultimate display of failure. But the collapse was not only physical. It was reputational, communal, personal. Her own HOA members began to turn on her. Voices once loyal now questioned her sanity. No permits. No approval. She's dragged us into a circus. Whispers spread through the crowd, followed by outright arguments. Some stormed off, unwilling to tie themselves to a leader whose pride outweighed reason. Others stayed only to film, knowing history was being written in mud and water. Karen, though, did not retreat. She raged on the platform, her voice cracking through the megaphone, insisting this was sabotage, that the farmer had booby-trapped the land, that he was a criminal standing in the way of progress. But her words fell flat. Even her most loyal allies knew the truth. She had pushed too far. She had trespassed too deep. And the land had delivered the only verdict it ever gives. Respect it or be swallowed by it. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the bulldozers were abandoned, half-submerged monuments to arrogance. Karen sat slumped in her chair, mascara streaked, her megaphone silent at last. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the sound of crickets and the soft ripple of the pond. The farmer watched from his porch, calm and steady, sipping his evening coffee as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The collapse was complete. Karen's empire of papers, speeches, and false authority had crumbled. The HOA no longer rallied behind her. The county no longer entertained her complaints. The community no longer believed her stories. All that remained was mud, silence, and the lesson the land had carved into history. But even in defeat, Karen's pride flickered. Somewhere inside her, the belief still lingered that she could rise again, that one final play might restore her power. The farmer knew better. Pride does not vanish overnight. But when arrogance collapses, it never rebuilds the same. The stage was set for the end. The morning after the collapse was quiet. Too quiet. The fields, usually buzzing with tractors or alive with the sound of cattle, seemed to hold their breath. The bulldozers still sat where they had sunk, half swallowed by mud, their yellow frames dulled by the weight of water and soil. They stood like tombstones, markers of arrogance that would never be forgotten. Karen did not return that day, nor the day after. The convoy of SUVs that once lined the hay road no longer appeared. The megaphones, the neon notices, the endless patrols. All of it vanished as if a storm had passed. Meadowbrook Estates retreated behind its gates, its residents shaken by the chaos, ashamed of the spectacle, unwilling to march under Karen's banner again. For the farmer, the silence was not victory. It was peace restored. But it was also bittersweet. The land had endured, yes. It had defended itself in the way only soil, mud, and time could. Yet the scars remained. The hay road bore the deep ruts of bulldozer treads. The pond carried the reflection of sunken machines. The fences were littered with the tattered remnants of neon papers, curled and faded by rain. Still, the farm breathed easier. No more clipboards, no more shouting. Just the rhythm of cattle grazing, the steady hum of crickets at dusk, the way the land always sounded when left to itself. But Karen's story did not vanish entirely. Word of the collapse spread far beyond the county. Videos of the sinking bulldozers went viral just as the SUV footage had. News anchors chuckled over the clips. Late-night hosts mocked the absurdity of a suburban HOA waging war against a farm. Strangers commented online, hailing the farmer as a symbol of patience and defiance against arrogance. The tale of Meadowbrook Estates versus the land became a legend of sorts, told with laughter at diners, in feed stores, and around county fairgrounds. Within Meadowbrook, Karen's reign ended quietly but decisively. The HOA board voted her out, citing misuse of funds and embarrassment to the community. She tried to rally again, to spin the story as sabotage, but no one followed. Her neighbors were done being dragged into her crusade. Some even approached the farmer directly, offering apologies, Small gestures of respect that had been missing before. A basket of bread, a handshake at the market, a muttered word of thanks. Karen herself faded into the background. Her sun hat no longer appeared at local gatherings. Her megaphone no longer echoed across the fields. Rumors spread. Some said she moved away. Others claimed she stayed but rarely left her house. Pride, once louder than tractors, had shriveled into silence. The farmer never gloated. That was not his way. He did not celebrate the humiliation of a neighbor, even one who had brought chaos to his door. Instead, he sat on his porch in the evenings, coffee in hand, staring out across the fields that had weathered storms greater than any HOA. He knew the truth. The land does not need to boast. It simply endures. As summer rolled on, the scars began to heal. Grass grew over the ruts left by the bulldozers. The pond's surface smoothed, its ripples once again the quiet drinking place for cattle and ducks. The fences, repaired and cleaned, stood firm against the horizon. What Karen had tried to erase, the land reclaimed, reminding everyone who truly owned the soil. In the end, the resolution was not written in lawsuits or county rulings. It was written in silence, in the way the farm stood strong long after the HOA's noise had died out. Heritage had endured, patience had triumphed, and arrogance, for all its noise and bluster, had drowned itself in mud. The farmer knew there would always be new challenges. Storms, markets, changing seasons. But he also knew that no suburban empire, no entitled neighbor, no flood of neon notices could ever outweigh the bond between a family and its land. The soil remembered, and it always would. The war was over. The farm was home again,